Okay, welcome to part 2 in how to tell a great story in video. You can make all the effort in the world to go out and find a film, to shoot a film, to edit it, to script it, to put it together, to produce it. But if it's not compelling, if nobody wants to look at it, you've wasted your time because nobody's ever going to see what you did. So the question is not how to shoot and how to edit. You can find that on YouTube anywhere you want. The question is, what is the secret to making a film compelling? That is, what is the secret to making a video or a TikTok or a movie or whatever you're doing connect with people? People have to have an emotional connection. If they can have an emotional connection with the film or the video that you're making, then you've got them. Once you make that emotional connection, you can convince people pretty much of anything. But that emotional connection is really important. And how do you do that? How do you do that? As we saw in part 1, the answer to how to shoot and structure a piece is in front of you all the time, because all you got to do is put on Netflix. Any series, any movie is basically there. All the secrets are all there. Just take it apart and look at it shot by shot and understand how it's structured. So let's apply the same thing to the notion of storytelling, particularly film and video. So here's a good question for you. What makes Exodus, Muhammad, Star Wars, Casablanca, and Breaking Bad similar? The answer is they're all the same story. Remarkably, they're all exactly the same story, just different locations, different character names, but fundamentally the same story. What do I mean by that? Every great story throughout history, every great story that works, millions and millions, billions of stories get told, but only a few resonate with us. It's like a great piece of music that suddenly everybody loves. So we are, as a culture, we're great storytellers. We tell stories all the time. You tell stories all the time. When you look at this video, you're going to go home and you're going to say to your friends, I saw this amazing video that changed my life, or I saw this thing, it's a total waste of time, a piece of crap. That's storytelling. We are, as a species, as a human species, we are storytellers. We've been telling stories all our lives, from the very first time that Cro-Magnons painted drawings on the caves of Lascaux. We are innate storytellers. That's who we are. It's in our DNA to tell stories. Some stories stick with human species forever. Other stories are forgotten right away. The stories that stick with us, the story of Muhammad, the story of Jesus, the story of the Exodus and Moses, those stories stick with us forever because there's something basic about the story that connects with us as human beings. It's almost in our DNA. And all of those stories, whether it's the Exodus and whether it's Muhammad, whether it's Jesus, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Breaking Bad, whether it's the movie Casablanca, the ones that, in kind of a Darwinian sense, that survive and we still find interesting. I mean, the story of Exodus and Moses is 3,500 years old, and we still remember it to this day. Why is that? What is it about that story that makes it stick with us? It's fairly simple. It starts off with a average person. All right, he's a prince of Egypt, but he's an average person. He's found in the reed boat. And the average person then is faced with a challenge that they don't particularly want to do, but they have to. And so they accept the challenge. First, they try to run away from the challenge, and then they accept the challenge, and then they go through all kinds of difficulties, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, and in the end, they are successful. That is the story of Moses, right? Essentially, he goes into the desert, and God comes with the burning bush and says, you have this mission. He says, I don't really want to do it. And then he goes back, and he introduces Pharaoh, and they have the plagues, and he tries to get out, and he separates the end. And in the end, he gets, the Israelites out of Israel. It's a classic arc of story. The arc of story is no different from Star Wars. It's exactly the same story. Or the arc of story is no different from the movie Casablanca, right? Rick runs the cafe in Casablanca. He wants a low key. He doesn't really want to get involved. Then he's faced with this challenge because of the letters of transit. And he runs away from the beginning. He doesn't want to get involved. And then he rises to the occasion and he goes through all these difficulties. And finally, he gets in the end, he becomes the great person because he says, you take the letters of transit, you go with your husband, he needs you for his work. Victor Laszlo, go. And he stays behind. And of course, then he runs off in the end. He says, Louis, this is the beginning of beautiful friendship. It's the Moses story told all over again. Star Wars is exactly the same thing. The story of Muhammad, he's a trader, and suddenly he's in the cave, and God approaches him, and the angel tells him, you have to do this mission, and he doesn't really want to do it, and he comes back, and he begins to preach, and he has all this difficulty, and he goes to Yathrib, which becomes Medina, and then there's the battles, and then in the end he's successful, and Islam takes off as a religion. The story of the Buddha is exactly the same story. The story of Jesus is exactly the same story. Breaking Bad is the same story. Walter White, he's the high school chemistry teacher. He develops cancer, and he doesn't really want to do it, and then he becomes the drug dealer, and he makes all the money, and he's difficulty. Every great story is exactly the same arc of story. A character, they're faced with a challenge, they don't want to do it, they pick up the challenge, they have a difficulty, ups and downs, and then finally they succeed. This architecture succeeds there are other ways to tell stories, but this architecture succeeds every single time for a reason that we can all relate to that story. It's something that, as human beings, it just resonates with us. So when you go to make your film or your movie or your video or your news story, because we do this with news organizations all the time, if you can take that architecture and then you can marry that structure, find a character, create this arc of story, and have the conclusion at the end, you will find that you have created something that people actually want to watch. It's fairly simple. It's a little like composing music. There are basic rules of music composition. There are basic rules of art composition, rule of thirds and stuff like that. There are basic rules of color. There are basic rules of the grammar and the architecture of storytelling. And that is one of the fundamental basic rules. So when you go out to make your film, we'll talk about this in part 3. The very first thing you have to do is you have to find your character, and then you have to create, whether it's a documentary or fiction, it doesn't really make any difference. They're all basically the same. You have to create this tension, this arc of story, this conflict, and then this resolution. And if you can learn to do that in every story that you do, even if it's like a minute 20 news package or a 6-part documentary, or a feature film, if you can learn to do that, you will have a successful film every single time. I guarantee it.